So we already know Steve Hopkins and Steve Hodges, and Buzz, why don't you just say a little bit about yourself?
So I'm Buzz. I work with the North American Mission Board here in Ohio, planting churches, and we specifically in the eastern part of the state, so a lot of the small town, rural spaces, Marion County being one of those. But yeah, so it's kind of what I do. I live in Columbus, though, or the Westerville area, and go to a church plant called Citizens Church there. So, yep.
First question is for Stephen Hodges. Tell us a little bit more about the OBN. We have these meetings. What else do we do? How do we specifically help church planting and church revitalization besides just having these rallies?
That's a great question. So my own church kind of background was I ended up at my own home church on staff after several years of ministry, and I was, one of the titles I got was missions pastor. And I don't really know why, but that was there. And so the pastor kind of said, okay, now you're going to do the evangelistic activities, and you're going to look at the training we do, and you're going to do this. And I was like, okay. And as I started looking at it, what we found was, and he mentioned this earlier, when you asked everybody at Lakeside, the church I was at, hey, how do people get saved at Lakeside? The answer was, well, we bring people to church, then they go to Discovering Membership class with Pastor Art, and he gets them saved. So that's nice that people are getting saved at the church, right? Except that nobody in the church saw it as their responsibility to do the ministry of outreach and evangelism. And so we began to really intentionally look at, okay, how do we reculture that? And I think a lot of the things that I've found in being a pastor is the way maybe we used to do things, like missions was, at least in some churches, the churches I was a part of for a long time had this idea, we send a check once a month to the people over there doing it. We've covered missions. Right? So one of the things that we're intentionally doing at our church is we're trying to make sure that people understand missions isn't over there. Missions is wherever the Christians are, and it's everybody's responsibility. And so instead of just sending a check out once a month, and you know, they don't even know who they are. They just know we send them checks. And trying to make them fewer and fewer missionaries that we support at a greater and greater level so we can have actual relationship with them. And so between that and helping people in the church understand it's not the pastor's job to reproduce sheep. It's the sheep's job to reproduce sheep, right? And of course, I'm one of them. So that's one of the reasons I'm excited about what OBN's doing, is because as we were looking at what's OBN going to be about, it wasn't just we want to take on a revitalization project so we can send a check to somebody once a month and go, yeah, we did our job. One of the things we intentionally try to do is not only have a revitalization project, but try to get individual pastors to meet with the guy and coach him through a particular aspect of the ministry. And churches partner for special projects, whether it's financial projects or a vacation Bible school project or a blitzing project. And so we try to make it a combination of, yes, there's the financial support because it's necessary, but also it's the relational impact and the relational connection to those churches. And so as David's come off of that and received a lot of that, and we've been blessed to see that, hopefully as Jordan comes on, not only financially do we invest there, but the OBN collectively continues that, hey, we're going to be personally involved in helping make this happen and see this come together. And so as Jordan talked about financial support, the OBN as a group, if he comes on, some of you guys know this and some of you don't, the OBN as a group will send monthly support to Jordan and the church. That doesn't preclude or exempt individual churches from also partnering on a one-to-one basis. So the OBN wants to just really keep this in the forefront and lead the charge and make evangelism through local churches and new churches just a constant part of what we're doing here in Ohio, and just try to champion that and give the guys and the ladies that are on board with that a place to come together and encourage each other and be challenged to just keep on.
That's well put. Feel free, if either one of you guys ever just want to chime in on a question also, feel free anytime. So, Buzz, I got a question for you. As
Great.
pastors, we kind of, we want to gather sheep and gather sheep and gather sheep, but in church planting and specifically, there has to be a point where we say, instead of gathering, we need to send. How do we turn that corner?
Ooh, that's a good question. Did we talk about this before? We probably did. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, I think, that goes with that. I think it's just the idea of, when you get to a building and you kind of outgrow that space, the question that you're asking is, well, what do we do? We're kind of at this point where it's like, we got so many people coming, what do we do? Do we start another building campaign, or do we think about, do we plant a church? Do we send some folks out rather than let's make this mega church building, kind of idea? I'll just give you a quick example real quick of something that I think is kind of interesting when it comes to just keep continuing to build, because we just keep getting bigger. There's a church up in Akron called the Akron Baptist Temple. Some of you might be aware of that church up there. That church at one point in time was the largest church in America in the 1960s. Okay, you go up there today, that building sits empty, and they're about to tear it down because they sold it, and then the church that bought it, they couldn't afford it essentially, and that building sits vacant, and it's going to be non-existent here. So in a sense, what I'm saying is, I think strategically we think about maybe, what does it look like to have these smaller congregations all throughout different parts of the city or our neighboring cities, to kind of have that sort of vision. And within that, too, one of the important pieces is raising up pastors, raising up elders within our churches, to be able to send them out, to train them, to get them ready to go as you send people with them too. So I think it's like a discipleship kind of culture that you're kind of creating. Is we don't want to be about seating capacity. We want to be about sending capacity and making that kind of shift on, man, we're not trying to build our kingdom here. We're about God's kingdom. And we feel like one of the best ways that we can do that is plant churches. Because if you think about it, what did Jesus leave the church with when it comes to evangelism? He left the church. He left the local church to be able to do that. That's God's plan A, to reach the world. And so we think, and we really believe, that church planting is one of the best ways to reach people, start something new, and kind of have this evangelistic discipleship approach to reach lost people in those different communities and spaces. So that's definitely part of it, I think. But it's tough. It's tough to change that idea about seating capacity and sending capacity. But I think it can happen over time if it's continued to be pushed, and it's continued to be pushed in the culture of discipleship within the church. Does that make sense? Okay, thanks.
All right. Steve Hopkins, you said something that during your presentation earlier, you said, with everything we do, we must ask, how does this help us share the gospel? That's a good question that struck a chord with me. It made me think of this, that like often in churches, there can be ministries that exist just because that's the way, they've always done it, or we've always done it. But how can we as pastors redirect this energy of doing things just because we've always done it to evangelism and outreach, and maybe more effective, connected to our mission?
Yeah, I think that's, and it's an incremental process. So it's not something, if you go back this week and think, okay, I'm going to announce Sunday that we're now doing away with all these programs, and just, you probably are going to be sending a resume wanting a job somewhere. But you got to constantly be helping people understand and keep the vision before them of why we're here. You got to ask the question, why? So constantly be asking the question, why? Why are we doing what we're doing? And if it doesn't match up with the New Testament, and it doesn't address what I believe is the world's greatest need, lostness, with the world's greatest answer, which is Jesus, then we've got to ask the question, why are we doing this? And I think for me, that's the key thing, is that you ask of everything, everything's on the table. And you ask why, and then you begin incrementally. Start where you can. So many times I see people who, they hear about a great idea and they want to go from a 4 on the scale to a 10, and it blows up on them. Start. What's the next step? How can we move the next step incrementally and begin moving some of those things? And so you look for, what are those things that are the low-hanging fruit? What are some of those areas of our church that we can really transform and change into an evangelistic mindset? And how can we really begin to see people come to know the Lord through these things. And it may be little tweaks. There's some things that you may have to have some major changes on, but there are a lot of little tweaks along the way that can really help. So.
All right, this next question is just kind of free game. Every church here, and every church period, has to balance evangelism with discipleship. And sometimes churches can be so discipleship oriented they may lack in evangelism, while other times it could be so evangelistic oriented they may lack in discipleship. How do we balance the two? And maybe what would your advice be to a church that errs on one side or the other for correction? Just some practical helps.
I know our church is in the process of rebalancing. What I mean by that is when I came, the church literally had never even heard the word discipleship. And so for about 4 or 5 years, that's all we talked about was discipleship. And after about 5 years, we had genuinely grown up an understanding of discipleship, and there was a core of our church multiplying disciples. We were, at about 5 years, we were seeing our second generation of discipled people beginning to disciple. And so as we saw the church that had been exclusively evangelistic, although it was pastorally evangelistic, as we saw that kind of swing, we sort of intentionally went past balance in order to get to balance and got discipleship hammered down. Then we sort of went, okay, now we make a little swing now back to, now that everybody understands it's everybody's job to make disciples, don't forget it's everybody's job to reach the people we are discipling. And so we talked about discipleship for a long time, and then we kind of came back and went, all right, now really what Jesus said was make disciples. Disciple making is the reaching and training, not just the training. So we kind of on purpose got out of balance in order to eventually come back to balance. We're not great at it yet, but that was kind of the approach we took in terms of what you're talking about, finding that balance. We had to find discipleship and then find the balance.
Steve? He's the expert on this one, this guy.
Yeah, right. The thing that I would just add, I think what Steve has said is just so dead on. But remember, the raw material of a disciple is that person that doesn't know Jesus yet.
Yeah.
So you think in terms of discipleship, you don't think of, okay, let me go find a believer I can make a better believer. Go find someone who doesn't know Jesus and help them become a disciple. And probably the second thing too, and I appreciate what Steve said about kind of moving the pendulum back, but also realize that there are some rhythms in the life of the church, and you won't always be in perfect balance. Steve, like Steve says, the pendulum, but there will be some rhythms. And so when you find yourself in a rhythm that's strong toward discipleship, do just what Steve said. We gotta bring us back to some evangelism. And so you might find a good rhythm there that kind of moves through the pace. I know the churches when I pastored, we had a rhythm where there were a couple times during the year that we wanted to be about evangelism all the time, but there were a couple times a year we were going full bore on evangelism. And then we kind of would sit back and take a breath and begin to disciple those that have been reached, and then we go forward. So, and for you what those rhythms might be. It might be Easter and Christmas, might be your two big evangelistic pushes. You need to find the beginning of the school year is a great time for a good evangelistic push. So just you find the rhythm for your church between discipleship and evangelism, and that really can make all the difference in the world.
Good. I have one more question, and then we'd like to open up the floor for a couple. So if you guys have any, just be on hand if you can. When you first started your presentation in the last hour, you really hit on another thing that was really good, talking about we used to have home field advantage, and the advantage of that was even people that have maybe aren't active members, they used to still be able to speak the church lingo. But today we have some people in our culture today that if they come into the church, it may be their very first time ever in a church. And before we know it, we're talking about creating an evangelistic culture. They're hearing people say, hey, brother, how are you doing? We're here to make disciples. Oh, we're having communion today. Before you know it, they're hearing all these words that they've never heard of before. They're all these church words that unless you've been in church, you don't know it. How can we be intentional about not having so much, not getting rid of church culture, but also making it feel like that when people come in that don't have a background in church, we're not speaking a different language to them.
Yeah, the thing I think about with that is, I think it's one thing that can help at least is kind of this one-on-one relationship aspect of a very seasoned believer being put together with that person that comes to the church that does not speak the church lingo, because Steve's absolutely right. I mean, we live in it's a post-Christian culture is where we are at. And I saw this almost 10 years ago when I served over in Europe. They were in a post-Catholic culture, and church lingo and all that kind of stuff. And they didn't have a clue. And so when you would even meet with somebody that was even Catholic, you would start from very basic stuff that they were just like, I never learned that. I never knew that, because they were reading the Bible on their own. And so I think that's one of the ways that could be super helpful is if you've got people within your church that, love, very relational, love other people, know the Bible well, and that want to be paired up with somebody that kind of steps into there and be like, hey, like, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, can I get some help? Don't put that on the pastor, but put it on somebody else, because that's great discipleship for the person discipling them, that they get to step into that relationship. So that's one of the things that I think about with that question is, man, help your people, help these new people coming in as they experience that.
That's good. James White, I think it's James White, has a book called Meet Gen Z. That really helped me a lot. So one of the things that we did, and I think he brings this out in that book, is we taught on Acts 2 versus Acts, I think it's 17, so 16 or 17. And what I found was our people were really frustrated and they didn't even know why. And they were trying to do evangelism like they lived in an Acts 2 culture where everybody was primed with all the church lingo and church experience and Judeo-Christian morals, and they knew they were sinners and they just needed to hear about Jesus to make that little step. And really we're living like at Mars Hill, where when Paul preaches at Mars Hill, he didn't even name Jesus in the sermon. I was like, what? So when our people realized, and so it was just sort of that pastoral help of, hey, here's why your old evangelism ideas aren't hitting anymore. They were kind of like, so it's okay that people don't just get saved the first time I talk to them. And some of those kind of things really helped with that language, because we told our people, look, you're not talking to the Acts 2 people anymore. You're talking to people that have never heard of Jesus. And so I thought it did two things. One is it helped them realize it's easy for them to engage because they know those things. But it also made our people really have to go, what does grace mean? What does communion mean? What does reconciled mean? And it was really a good growing experience for the people of our church that engaged with that, because they had to go, I know the language and I know how to use it in context, but do I really know what it means? Yeah, and so it was good.
Yeah, and can you teach somebody else what it means? Because there's something different about knowing it, but then also teaching it as well, right? We can know things, but we don't necessarily know how to teach things that we know. Yeah, that's a good point.
That's good. I can't add much. That's good. It is fun to listen to people's language. Somebody calls me up and say, let's get together for fellowship. I pretty well know it's somebody from a church background. But if we're going to get together for coffee, I don't know that, so it's, yeah. And then, of course, you throw them into the mix if any of you are Southern Baptists, and they start talking about NAM and IMB and,
Lottie Moon.
Yeah, Annie Armstrong, Ray Roberts. Who in the world? I, had one person in the church ask me one time, when are we going to get that Lottie Moon thing paid off?
So what'd you tell them?
Told them never.
Till Jesus comes back,
Till
right?
Jesus comes, that's right.
Does anybody have a question from the audience? Go ahead, Josh.
How would you instruct guys that are pastoring an older congregation, bringing new, young Christians in the same environment, and now it's multi-generational with different terms, different language, lingo, in some knowing church culture, many not knowing church culture. So how do you blend that together in unity with love when there's such differences? Millennials were weird at one point, and now the next generation's even worse.
Yeah.
And so how do you blend that multi-generational, multi-ethnic type church body?
Yeah, stop blaming everything on the millennials because it's not their fault anymore. Okay.
Amen.
I speak from a man of experience with that. But the one thing I think of, Josh, is celebrate the wins with a multi-generational church, especially with the older people, to see how beautiful it is to see a congregation that looks so different in age range and age levels, because I think that's such an important thing. But it's not typically what we do, right? Because in our sinfulness, we want to be around people that look like us, that act like us, are the same age as us, have the same interests as us. But that's not what the church is to be. It's to be a multi-generational aspect that have different interests, different age levels, different groups, worshiping together, united in unity. And so I would just sit down with them older folks, with these new people coming in, and say, man, look what the Lord is doing. Let's celebrate this win and having this multi-generational feel where we've got babies crying during the sermon. Praise God for that, right? That's a good thing to have, because some of these churches, they haven't seen that in decades, right? And so to celebrate those wins, that's the first thing I think about. Let's celebrate this multi-generational thing that's taking place within our churches, and that younger people behind us are coming up to follow the Lord, because guess what? Someday they're going to be in those exact same shoes, right? They're going to be the old people in the church. And hopefully they wish that we had some young people and some babies crying in the sermon as well.
I think it's a really good opportunity just to reteach some things that were sort of intrinsic in culture that have been lost in culture. Like when I was growing up, hanging out with your grandparents was cool and you did it all the time. But I don't know anybody does that anymore. And if they do, it ain't cool because they don't have screens, right? And so going back to Titus 2 and just going, hey guys, God's told us since, the beginning of the church, it should be the older people in the church instructing and training the younger people in the church. And so then as a pastor, you get kind of the excuse to look at the younger generation and go, quit being so arrogant and listen to the older people that have lived life. Now, you say it a little nicer than that, obviously, but and then you get to look at the older people and go, hey, quit complaining that they don't do it your way. You're going to be gone in a little while, and somebody needs to carry on the church. Either we're going to invest in them and train them, or we're not. And so it gives you a challenge opportunity for both generations to come together. And then like you were talking about with training versus teaching, we just told the older folks ministry in our church and the youth ministry in our church, once a year, you'll invite the other group to join you for something. And so we just told them you have to get together a couple of times a year to intentionally foster those relationships. And they weren't really excited about it at first. But when they realized the other group doesn't bite, it wasn't so bad after that first shot.